Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Letty Bermudez Double Fermentation Thermal Shock Processed Colombia from Hydrangea Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Hydrangea, based out of Berkeley, California. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel. As their coffee roaster, I had zero familiarity with going into this review. And while I had zero familiarity with this coffee roaster, I certainly have a fair bit of familiarity with this coffee, as the Letty Bermudez finished first place in our top 10 coffees of 2021 list. And we did revisit this coffee 1 year later when we reviewed it from Archetype. And for anybody that's not familiar with the Letty Bermudez, then it is one of the most discussed coffees over the last couple of years, as it is a coffee I've described as being one of the biggest game changers and transcendent coffees we have ever experienced due to its very unique and defined flavor profile. So it'll definitely be interesting to experience another coffee roaster's take on the Letty Bermudez, as this right here is day 35. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. And while it's difficult to tell sometimes with these more heavily processed coffees, this one definitely still remains on the lighter side of things, even if it isn't quite as light as Manhattan's version of the Letty Bermudez. Manhattan's version of the Letty Bermudez is a very, very light coffee. And while this one's still pretty light in general, it's not maybe to the same sort of lightness as that coffee is. Even then, still on the lighter side by most standards and metrics. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and ran it through the V60, and the first thing I noticed was that the cup isn't quite as blatant and in your face as previous versions of this coffee. The components felt a slight bit more subtle from this first impression, as it is a very peach forward coffee, but not quite as defined of a peach gummy sort of aspect, but rather a little bit more floral. Slightly different, but it's still a pretty good experience for this coffee. We continue on to day 17 as I ran it through the Chemex, and this was a much better second impression, as this one was a little bit more lively and sweet in general. This one was a little bit more reminiscent of previous versions of this coffee, as it offered a very ripe peach with a floral finish, as the listed jasmine felt very apt to this coffee. A slight citric quality was present as well, but for the most part, a much better second impression. Day 20 ran it through the April dripper, and it was even more subtle today than previous experiences, as there was the aroma of stone fruit and it was reminiscent of that vibrant peachy quality, but the cup itself continued to yield a little bit more of a subtle florality as opposed to a very vibrant and distinct peachy aspect to the cup. The other thing I found was this slightly pastry sweetness quality to the cup as well. So this one was a little different, not necessarily as enjoyable as those first 2 days. But we continue on to day 23. As I upped the temperatures, ran it through the V60, and this was the most vibrant cup to date with a wildly peach forward component to the cup. And one thing I do find interesting is that they do have a white peach note listed on here. I would say that it was a little bit more in line with the vibrant fresh fruit, the yellow sort of peach component to it, as it was reminiscent of that very sugary, very sweet sort of boba tea, peach boba tea sort of aspect that was maybe a little bit more in line with Archetype's version of this coffee. Even then, it was still near equally as vibrant in terms of those floral aspects as well. So a lot of really positive, sweet aspects on this. I think this was my favorite day of this coffee. Really enjoyed the way that this one came out on day 23. Day 26, same adjustments, ran it through the Chemex, and once again, it wasn't quite as vibrant through the Chemex, as there was a little bit more emphasis on the floral aspects on this day. A slightly more herbal aspect to the cup as well, as it felt very vibrant altogether, a little bit less in terms of the peachy direction, and that's the biggest and most consistent theme I found from brewing this coffee, was through the V60 I was getting a lot more of those peachy aspects, and that's why I did persist a little bit more with that brew method as opposed to either the April dripper or the Chemex, as those didn't seem to offer that same sort of peach vibrancy to them. On day 28, back to the day 23 recipe, once again through the V60, and it continues to offer a lot of those peachy, vibrant aspects all around. Standout factors continue to remain a very strong florality, and almost equal, if not more abundant of a measure. This time there was a slightly bitter aspect that was a little reminiscent of vanilla, so even more you could toss in line with that florality. Listed jasmine also continues to be pronounced, as it's another nice day of this coffee. Really enjoying the way that it's turning out, especially with the adjustments that we have made. And day 31, final notes. Cup has been mostly consistent ever since those adjustments, with the emphasis being a little bit more on the florality as opposed to the very strong peachy aspect, though both are in pretty significant measure within this coffee. Boba tea-like vibrancy remains in significant abundance as well, with a slight herbal and citric aspect to the cup too. So if anything, it's not necessarily skewing very heavily or particularly in one direction, but rather you're getting some pretty strong and vibrant components in a couple of different directions. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. All right, and we have 4 level 5s, so let's go through those real quick. And we will start with the finish at a level 5. Yes, this one actually definitely does justify that level 5 mark, as not only does it have that very strong sugary sweet quality to it, but it's a very long lasting one too. This has been pretty consistent with the Letty Bermudez coffees that I have had, as they do last a very long time. You are experiencing the finish in this coffee for an extended period, so don't have too much to say on that. Definitely a lot of sweet, sugary aspects within the finish. Sweetness, level 5. Yes, again, with Diego Bermudez's coffees, this has been a consistent theme, as not only this coffee, but then the Luna Bermudez, the Salma Bermudez, they are very sweet coffees in general. So this one right here has been right in line with a lot of those. And the other Letty Bermudez was also a super sweet cup of coffee. So I don't think that will come as a surprise that the sweetness is at a level 5. Even when compared to a lot of the other Letty Bermudez coffees that we have reviewed, they're all always going to reach that level 5. And when there are coffees that may be on the slightly higher side of the level 4, but don't reach that level 5 mark, it's because coffees like this exist, the ones that are super sweet in general. So this one still justifies that level 5 mark. Florality, level 5. That one's interesting. That's the biggest takeaway I'm going to have from this coffee as compared to the other Letty Bermudez coffees that we have reviewed. This one did skew a lot in terms of that floral direction, and it is worth noting that the notes they have listed on here are rose as well as a jasmine. So that's why I think it was just maybe a little different from the experience I had with Manhattan's version of the Letty Bermudez and Archetype's version of the Letty Bermudez, as this one did skew a lot more in the floral direction than either of those two coffees did. Stone fruit, level 5. Yes, even with the focus and emphasis I've had on the floral aspect, the stone fruit aspect is also very heavy and pronounced in this coffee. But that's Letty Bermudez in general. Letty Bermudez is a very peach-forward coffee, and that's what sold me on it in the first place, and it continues to remain that way no matter who is roasting this coffee. So definitely justified there. And now we have a handful of things at different marks that I feel like are worth discussing. We will start with the cleanliness, level 4. That's the same. That's the same thing I had with the other versions of the Letty Bermudez, as it's really hard for me to push it to that level 5, even with such a defined flavor profile to this one, mostly because there is a slight fermentiness. I mean, this is a very heavily processed coffee, and that's what makes this coffee so interesting, is even with all of the heavy processing to it, they still come out relatively clean because of the very defined profile to them. And while they might have a slight bit of funk, a slight bit of fermentiness, it's no way marred by the very defined profile that's within this coffee, because that really does continue to justify a higher side of the cleanliness to them. That's what makes these coffees special. Acidity, level 4. Yes, there is a fair bit of brightness to this cup as well. I think that will definitely come in line with the lighter profile to it, but don't really have too much to say on the brightness, just a fair bit of brightness to it. Citrus fruit, level 3. I can't recall whether or not that was a factor that was played in either of the other two Letty Bermudez coffees, but this one did have a slight citric quality to it throughout the entirety of the time I was drinking it, which was a little different as well. I'm just trying to pick out some differences between this one and the other Letty Bermudez coffees. Body level 2. I think that that's kind of interesting, because since this one was run through the V60, it is a heavier processed coffee, and it is a South American coffee still, even with all of the adjustments. That one might have been at the higher side of that, like a level 3. I think what might have played a role in that is that it's still technically a geisha. This goes against all conventional wisdom, a lot of these things I'm saying, because a lot of these things in theory shouldn't go together, but that continues to remain what Letty Bermudez is. In theory, on paper, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it seems to work out this way every time you try it. So for everything I've kind of articulated, I think that this is a pretty good representation of this tasting wheel from what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've said this before to a lot of people when it comes to Letty Bermudez. You can only have Letty Bermudez for the first time once. So the very first time I ever had Letty Bermudez, it definitely blew my mind, and it was something that it actually took me a little bit of time to really understand what I was drinking and just how unique of a coffee it was, because up to that point, I'd never experienced anything like Letty Bermudez before. And since then, I've had not only a couple of versions of Letty Bermudez, but I've had a couple of versions of Diego Bermudez's coffees that share profiles similar to this, clean but still wildly vibrant and pronounced. So that's what this coffee is, and having this experience again, I can say that I just tried to pick out a lot of the differences that I experienced from this version of the coffee when compared to the other versions of other Letty Bermudez coffees, and I really liked it. But I think that given that this one skewed a little bit more on the florality as opposed to a very specific defined sort of peach gummy ring aspect that was the Manhattan version of this coffee, I feel like I did enjoy the Manhattan version. I mean, that's one of my favorite coffees that I've ever reviewed on this channel, but it's still interesting. Every time I go back and I try this, a very peach forward coffee, it hits on the marks I'm looking for. It has great sweetness, it has great fruit components, it has great florality, and still offers wonderful clarity. And that's why it's going to continue to remain a very special coffee for me. So credit to Hydrangea. I don't want to take anything away because I feel like they did a very nice job with this coffee. Even if it may not be as enjoyable to me as the Manhattan version of it, I still think that Letty Bermudez is just such a special coffee, and I'm going to continue to give credit to any coffee roaster that seems to do it justice. So credit to Hydrangea on this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, once again, if you've actually never had an opportunity to try Letty Bermudez, then I will continue to push you towards it because it is just such a unique experience for pretty much everyone. Someone like myself who had had probably 10-ish years of drinking as many different coffees as I could, my mind was still blown the very first time I had Letty Bermudez, and I feel like everybody that has had it is just really kind of taken aback by what it does offer. So if you've never had it from any of the other coffee roasters, that's the first direction I'd point you towards. But for anybody that's still just kind of looking for something very unique that still offers a cleaner profile, then the Diego Bermudez coffees still continue to offer that, as this one right here had a very peach forward aspect to it. But even more importantly, that kind of floral component that did seem to dictate a lot of the cup while still offering some great sweetness to it all around. Very much reminiscent of the listed boba tea that they have on here, and kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Letty Bermudez Double Fermentation Thermal Shock Processed Colombia from Hydrangea Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.